Columbia Law School. I'm Katherine Franke. I am a professor here at the law school, and I direct our Center on Gender and Sexuality Law along with Suzanne Goldberg, who's also here somewhere. And I'm just so thrilled to be able to welcome such an incredible assembly of activists coming here to Columbia to think hard about what it means to do progressive political work, particularly queer and trans work, in an environment where so many of our movement organizations have come to embody the corporate form. It's, I think, quite fitting that we are here next to a compliance conference, a corporate conference, so we will now call ourselves the non-compliance conference. But I look forward to hearing about the interactions in the bathrooms later today. And feel free to mix it up and go over there for a little while and see what happens. So anyway, this conference is the brainchild of our Center's Engaging Tradition project, in particular Urvashi Vald, who's the project's director, and Dean Spade, who's been a visiting scholar with us for 2 years. In so many ways, the questions this conference provocatively poses are ones related to tradition, which is in some major way why we have this coming out of our Engaging Tradition project. Traditions of governance, traditions of financing, staffing, organizational performance, and goal setting. Our focus over these 2 days will be both the traditions that have emerged as a result of the corporate nonprofit form, but also of those traditions which we have lost or that have become very hard to preserve as a result of the incentive structures that the corporate edifice creates. In this sense, I see this gathering as one in which we try to recover some of the ways that we've imagined justice and redistribution that have been marginalized or worse, extinguished by what we could easily call gay incorporated. At the same time, we'll explore some of the creative alternative structures and organizational forms that have flourished outside of the long shadow that's been cast by dominant and well-funded LGBT organizations. I am particularly excited and delighted to have this conference here in this place at Columbia Law School. It gives me enormous pleasure to look out at all of you and to see the school, this building, filled with thoughtful, principled, fierce, creative, non-conventional, and outrageous activists. This is not our usual constituency in this room. Columbia Law School and Columbia University, after all, is an elite private university that, like other elite private universities, is increasingly run like a for-profit business. And indeed in ways that mirror some of the movement organizations that we gather here today to critique. So much of the critique, some of it, that many of you will offer will apply in equal measure to the university as it does to NGOs or so-called nonprofits. Columbia, rather than necessarily being formed in the public interest, sits here located in Harlem, but it doesn't regard Harlem as part of the university. Rather, it sits here like a citadel, walled off from the richness of the community that surrounds it. In similar fashion, the university fails over and again to acknowledge that this campus, the physical plant, the buildings we're sitting in, are located on Lenape land and territory. In important ways, these forms of erasure, theft, and colonial violence form the ground upon which we educate our students at Columbia, and tragically form the ground upon which so many of our movement organizations formulate their agendas. I look forward to learning from you and to the hard, even at times I'm sure, uncomfortable conversations and political thinking that we'll do over these 2 days. I have one request from all and each of you. Please leave behind a little piece of your radical queer selves, such that they may sink into the walls, and then reach out over the coming days, months, and years to infiltrate in a sneaky way our students here at Columbia, producing all sorts of delightful mayhem. So please do that. Leave a bit of yourselves. So this conference could not have taken place without the dedicated work of a large team of people. First, I want to thank the tireless efforts of Cindy Gao, the coordinator of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, who anticipated and nailed down every last detail of this conference. Cindy, are you in the room? I know you've been toting water. I think she just stepped out. When she comes back, we're going to give her a round of applause. Thank you so much, Cindy. In addition, I want to thank the staff of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, Ann Jonas, Katherine Franke, Hope Dector, and Janet Jacobson for all their intellectual, political, and logistical support and leadership for this conference. Mike Edwards and Carla Sutherland, who were part of our Engaging Tradition project, offered their time and their minds to making this conference a great success. And finally, the conference was funded, not founded, thankfully, funded in significant part by the Ford and Arcus Foundations. Thank you to them, too. And thank you to all of you, speakers and attendees who are here. So, a few logistics. First of all, we invite you, no, we implore you to tweet, blog, Facebook, if that's a verb, about the conference. We've opened up the Wi-Fi in the building today, so you don't need a username and password. Please use the hashtag #QueerDreams. You see it posted around the room, and we would be enormously grateful if you'd also mention our two centers, ECRW and our center, Gender Sex Law, in your tweets and blogs, etc. The proceedings, all of them, will be videotaped, and the plenary, will be audio taped, and the plenaries will be both audio and videotaped, and in short order will be available for you to stream, or for others who couldn't make it here, to stream online. Please check the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law's Facebook page when it's available, and if you haven't liked us yet, please do. Cindy, thank you. So, thank you for coming. Let's get started with the first panel. I'm going to turn around from being the welcomer to the moderator. Okay, our first panel is fantastic, as are all the other panels. So I want to introduce our speakers quickly, because many of you know them, and then if you're not familiar with them and their work and their affiliations, you can look them up in the brochures or online. Urvashi Vald, to my immediate right, but your immediate left, is an organizer and writer, and she directs our Engaging Tradition project, as I mentioned earlier. Before she came to us, she was the executive director of the Arcus Foundation, and before that was the deputy director of the Governance and Civil Society program at the Ford Foundation. She also, as many of you know, served as the executive director for the Gay and Lesbian Task Force. Her most recent book, which if you haven't read, you should, is Irresistible Revolution, Confronting Race, Class, and the Assumptions of LGBT Politics. Following Urvashi will be Dean. Dean Spade is an associate professor of law at Seattle University School of Law, and is currently with us for 2 years at the Engaging Tradition project here at Columbia. In 2002, he founded the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, a nonprofit collective that provides free legal help to low-income people and people of color who are trans, intersex, and or gender nonconforming, and works tirelessly to build trans resistance movements that are rooted in racial and economic justice. His most recent book, which if you haven't read, you should, is Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law. Next, we will hear from Andrea Smith, who is the co-founder of INCITE, Women of Color Against Violence, and was the editor of The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex. If ever there were a book that should have been the assigned reading for this conference, that is certainly it. And then last, NTanya Lee has been an activist, organizer, and movement builder in U.S. social justice work for 30 years, rooted in the fight backs against the rise of the right in the 80s and 90s, and after 11 years leading the grassroots racial and economic justice organization in San Francisco, NTanya spent a year interviewing more than 150 organizers across the country for the National Ear to the Ground project. She's now the founding member of LeftRoots, a new non-401c3 project of leftists engaged in grassroots movements. Welcome to all four of you. Let's begin.
Thank you all, and thank you, Katherine, so much for your wonderful words. Thank you all for being here. When I started working in the queer movement in Boston in the late 70s, formal LGBT organizations were very rare. Almost all the groups I worked with were not formally incorporated or registered with the government as nonprofits. Gay Community News was a collective, and decisions were made as a collective. Lesbian and gay media advocates, Alston Brighton Greenlight Safe House Project, Lesbians United in Non-Nuclear Action, the Feminist Caucus of the Boston Food Co-op. We were all volunteer groups and organized around goals and values and decision-making processes and theories of governance and accountability. Funders for lesbian and gay, bisexual, and transgender issues, an affinity group of foundation people, noted that there were about 50 LGBT organizations in 1969 in one of their reports. These groups had to fight to even get formal governmental approval. Lambda Legal Defense and Education Funds, for example, its founders noted that when it was formed in 1973, Lambda had to become its own first client. A New York judicial panel rejected the application of the organization to be recognized because, in their view, the mission was neither benevolent nor charitable. Lambda had to use pro bono lawyers to appeal to New York's highest court, which ultimately granted Lambda nonprofit recognition. Today, as we all know, large parts of queer work are dominated by the formally organized sector of nonprofit organizations. The 40 largest national LGBT organizations generated $208 million in revenue in 2011. These 40 organizations employed 925 staff people and had about 700 board members. While there isn't firm data on the full number of formally organized LGBT queer organizations in this country, if the Movement Advancement Project, a think tank on the LGBT movement, used the 2011 GuideStar database to identify 502 active LGBT nonprofits in 2011. These groups spent more than $508 million. Now, the context in which queer nonprofits operate is important for us to consider as we think about how to build our movements. Today's fight to shut down the federal government that's going on all around us has deep roots in US history. On a political level, it's a fight against federalism and a fight about the role of government in providing social support systems. But it bears noting that opposition to an expanded role for government in addressing poverty and in providing for the general good has long been fueled by two things. First, by white resentment at having to address the legacies of slavery and racism, and second, by the anti-communist, anti-statist ideologies that dominated US domestic and foreign policy for more than 50 years, since the 50s. The federal government's role in the provision of supportive services and its reliance on voluntary associations to do this expanded first in the aftermath of the US Civil War. The period of Reconstruction saw the emergence of, quote, new power for national organizations, parties, media, and the growth of the voluntary sector, according to nonprofit sector historian Peter Dobkin Hall. And this expansion of the federal role was resisted strongly by political leaders from southern states. Two other expansions of the federal role happened after the Depression through the New Deal, and in the 60s through the War on Poverty. Under the New Deal, the federal government implemented social insurance programs, unemployment insurance, Social Security, pensions, created the framework for labor law and workers' rights, and instituted the first federal income tax in 1943. Again, this expansion was vehemently resisted by conservatives and by industrial leaders who feared that the expansion of communism and socialism in the US was coming. When this framework was expanded again in the 60s and 70s through the implementation of war on poverty programs like food stamps, VISTA, EEOC, Head Start, HUD, it was resisted again by those who argued that a social safety net would create a dependency that would undermine people's willingness to work and thus undermine free enterprise. As the government's commitments and regulation grew and required higher taxes and deficit spending, anti-tax, anti-government, libertarian, and conservative movements began to organize more actively. Their intellectual leaders, like Lewis Powell, who went on to become a Supreme Court Justice, William Simon, who was Treasury Secretary and went on to run one of the major foundations on the conservative right, the Heritage Foundation. These people articulated a political and economic ideology: small government, less regulation, big defense sector, unfettered expansion for corporations. Their strategists forged alliances across previously isolated corners of the right wing and connected economic conservatives with religious or cultural conservatives who were worried about the impact of new social movements that were changing the power of women, people of color, and LGBT people. Ronald Reagan's presidency gave power to these reactionaries for the first time, and their mission was to dismantle the welfare state as it had come to be known and install a neoliberal state built upon deregulation, free trade, less taxation for corporations, privatization, devolution of services, the aggressive use of monetary and trade policy to expand the reach of U.S. businesses, and aided by technological shifts, the economic basis of the U.S. economy moved away from the production of goods to the production of technology and the outsourcing of services. Clinton and Bush, too, continued the work that Reagan began, cutting government programs and welfare, privatizing government programs through contracting and outsourcing, and expanding criminalization and surveillance, and increasing the military and police powers of the state. The Tea Party, a movement hatched in the corporate suites of the Koch brothers-funded think tanks and strategy firms, must be seen as just the latest manifestation of a carefully executed strategy for social dominance mapped out by right-wing funders and activists and achieved through a systematic construction of a policy, legal, political, intellectual, grassroots, media, and philanthropic infrastructure that is aimed at keeping social control for its owners. The results have been phenomenal. Conservatives helped elect presidents in 80, 84, 88, 2000. Well, they won conservative 2004. They won conservative majorities in 94, 2002, 2004, 2006, 2008, 2012 in the House. And they've won a huge amount of governor's races, state legislative races, and mayoral elections. Amidst all this change, the nonprofit sector has also grown dramatically, serving, as Miranda Joseph so wonderfully called it, as a metanym, a substitutive concept for the idea of community, at the very instant that such community was being destroyed by neoliberal economic policies. Peter Dobkin Hall notes that more than 90% of current nonprofits were formed after 1950, and most global NGOs are about 30, 35 years old. As government funding for poverty alleviation and housing, social services, health, and other social systems grew, nonprofits became the implementers, and a symbiotic relationship came into being between nonprofits, government funders, corporate and private philanthropic funders. Today, there are over 1.6 million tax-exempt organizations registered with the IRS as of 2012. Over 1 million of these are 501c3 public charities, and another 97,000 or so are 501c4 advocacy organizations. And this doesn't include another 330 religious congregations, 330,000. 330,000. Just, most of these nonprofits are small. Of the 1 million 501c3s filing Form 990 in 2010, 3/4 of them reported revenues under $500,000. Nonprofits with budgets over $10 million are just 4% of the total number of all public charities, but they account for 85% of all spending. Nonprofits are heavily funded by government, receiving almost 1/3 of their income from government sources and 2/3 from private sources, individual donations, and foundations. Nonprofits are a huge part of the workforce. Nonprofit organizations accounted for 5.5% of the gross domestic product in 2010. We accounted for 10% of the total workforce of 13.7 million people who work for nonprofits, and accounted for 9.2% of all salaries and wages paid in the United States. This is a big sector, and it touches so many households. More than 63% of all households have donated to a nonprofit. 27% of the U.S. population says they have volunteered for a nonprofit in 2011. I share these basic data points to give us a framework to think about the challenges facing queer nonprofits. Neoliberal policies have had a paradoxical effect. They've reduced the available funding for social services, but they've increased the demand for those services through increased unemployment, dislocation, inequality, and the abandonment of people who had previously been supported by a social safety net. So for me, the key issue facing all movements working under neoliberalism is, how are we going to overturn these policies? It's a political question. Specifically, how do LGBT activists propose to meet the following kinds of challenges as we work to address the redistribution of resources for all parts of our community. The first challenge that we're facing in the queer movement and social justice movements is that government at every level has less money and is often running at a deficit. And at the very instant that our movements seek support to support the lives of queer seniors, queer youth, homeless people, to de-incarcerate people, to decriminalize, to invest in workforce and employment, there's less money to go around. Now, queers came to the funding scene very late as a community. Really, nobody supported us except each other until the 80s, when we started to see some philanthropic and government dollars flowing in steady numbers to HIV/AIDS organizations. You know, there are 81,000 private foundations in this country. In 2011, they gave away about $50 billion. In that same year, only 383 foundations funded LGBT work and gave away $123 million to queer organizations, and that comprised 0.26% of all giving. The reason I share these data points is that while we are all critical of many aspects of nonprofit work, I think it bears remembering that our communities do need support and supportive services. And a key challenge remains, how are we going to maintain that support in this changing economic context? A second challenge facing LGBT nonprofits is that the neoliberal mantra of reinventing government turned into a massive outsourcing of government services to private corporate hands. Private contractors, private for-profit contractors, do a lot of the work of government agencies and services. And they see this as a huge market. And this is a challenge for nonprofits. A third challenge for queer nonprofits is the challenge of mobilizing our communities. A majority of our communities are not engaged in nonprofit work, certainly, or I would argue in the movement. Most LGBT people are not connected to the formal infrastructure that exists. And this is a challenge that I think many groups in this room are addressing, the challenge of weak participation. I think that groups are addressing it through organizing and membership-based structures that foster the leadership of people in our communities and seek to give control over decisions made by the organizations to those they claim to serve. A final challenge we face is that the infrastructure we have created in the queer world operates in undemocratic and troubling ways. Queer nonprofits are in an especially peculiar position, I think, because our infrastructures are so new that they often turn for professional expertise to more established nonprofits and consultants who do not have a social justice vision. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of LGBT nonprofits do not have a social justice mission themselves. In other words, a mission that includes seeking economic justice or racial justice or gender justice. Most of our own communities' nonprofits don't have that in their missions. Much less do they have an economic analysis that might lead us to engage to fight the Tea Party mindset. How can we ensure that queer nonprofits act more queerly, that they operate less like conventional corporations and more like transformation-oriented institutions, that they operate internally and externally in values grounded in equity, and that they develop methods to increase participation, internal democracy, greater accountability to the people that they purport to serve, and that they pay attention to issues of workplace equity, fair pay for all, work-life balance, these kinds of issues within the nonprofit themselves. So in conclusion, I think, to me, I go back to the fundamental question for me is a political question. How do we propose to address the neoliberal context in which we operate as movements and as nonprofits? Thank you.
So Urvashi and I are doing this job of trying to just set up the conference, so that these people can bring their other brilliance. So I'm just going to give a little bit more context. That was really helpful, I think, kind of seeing the development of this sector really rapidly and its size and shape, I think is really useful to us. I want to mention a little bit more about the Revolution Will Not Be Funded specifically, which came out in 2009, that was edited by INCITE, because that book was so transformative for so many of us. It took a lot of things that we all felt and experienced in our day-to-day work, trying to meet urgent needs and feeling the ways in which forms of professionalization and nonprofit framings hem in work and contain it, and it put it into this anthology where all these brilliant activists were like actually laying that out, how it looked in their own work, and what it meant. Some of the big takeaways I got from that book is just like, also if you haven't read it, just like decent reasons to read it. One big takeaway for me was just a picture that was drawn in that book of how one of the things that the 501c3, like the nonprofit actual structure does, is allow rich people to like keep their piles of money and to say that they're doing something good, but really they mostly like spend it paying each other to be trustees, and also it's entirely run by like predominantly white men, and so they're getting to have control of that money, and then they also don't have to like get taxed on. Not that we believe the tax system pays for anything besides war, mostly, but you know, like still that it's this idea of kind of preventing them from being taxed and instead focusing on their pet projects or paying their relatives to be on boards. Also, that this story about how nonprofitization shifted the shape of organizations, and Urvashi mentioned this, towards professionalization, right? So that when you organize movements, when you fund and organize movements to look like corporations, they look like corporations. So you have like white people, disproportionately people with professional degrees at the top. There's an idea that those people are the best leaders, that those people are the experts, and that this thing should be run like a business. And even like the language of the nonprofit, right? The kind of CEO, CFO language that kind of came to dominate that, and the kind of internal hierarchies that we see inside the organizations that really mirror the same ways we would see that inside any corporation, in terms of like people of color and women getting paid the least, and the ways that educational privilege and things like that work. Also, this really significant shift for social justice movements, when you compare like the movements of the 60s and 70s to what emerged in nonprofitization, this kind of funding of two main things: depoliticized social services, so social services that are not in the context of like, hey, let's have free breakfast together and talk about why there's not good access to food in our communities, or let's, you know, kind of get the things we need in a space where we're also talking about how we can get together into the root causes of why we don't have the things we need, but instead the kind of social services that so many of us are familiar with that really like are more moralizing and that act like if you need services or something wrong with you, and they're very individualizing, and they're not about getting together, they're about kind of like judging people, and people feel lesser for seeking services and are treated as lesser, and professionals get to decide who's the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. That whole framework, sort of that plus law and policy reform, totally divorced from kind of a grassroots organizing framework, became kind of the funded strategies, and grassroots organizing and base building virtually are invisible in those realms, right? There's like vaguely something called empowerment work, but it's this kind of like tokenized thing where mostly the people directly impacted aren't seen as authors of the strategy or as the most informed experts who should guide the agenda, and there's not an idea of building tons and tons of leaders. There's the idea of like a few experts who graduated from the right, you know, law school programs and public health programs who are gonna, you know, figure out the end of poverty for us all. We've seen how good that's worked out. So that's a really different concept, and yet there's this dilemma that Urvashi talks about that's so important, where there's the need for services is drastic, right? Because during the same period, the wealth gap has expanded, and so many of the kind of basic services that ever existed in the very inadequate U.S. Welfare system have even further been cut or removed. So there's extreme community crisis, and then only these kinds of really inadequate solutions. And then, of course, that book also helped us see just kind of the dilemma of philanthropic control of the agenda, the fact that funders' whims guide what work happens in that context, and that organizations have to chase after funders' whims instead of there being like a long-term strategy determined by what communities have experienced and the wisdom people have from having fought violence for so long. And also that, you know, of course, like rich people are unlikely to fund the end of wealth. So, and ultimately, this just sort of has been a really excellent containment strategy for social justice work. So, you know, that book also helped us pair together the strategies like COINTELPRO and the ongoing surveillance and criminalization of activists and organizations doing radical root causes work with the kind of, so that's like the stick, and then the carrot is, right, the money to do the work that's like the depoliticized or less threatening work. So INCITE in particular produced this book in part because this analysis has been really centrally, strongly developed in thinking about the anti-violence movement, right, and thinking about the shift from people organizing like shelters run by and for survivors of domestic violence to the move towards like kinds of shelters we see now that are the way that kind of all homeless shelters and group shelters and jails and prisons are like incredibly policing and punitive and not grassroots based and not based in kind of an organizing framework, but instead a kind of individualized, medicalized, depoliticized form, and how weird that is, right? How this movement that named this important set of violences and that was really structured to dismantle sort of a patriarchal framework and have this critique of marriage and family formation norms and sexual violence became this kind of like other sort of social services space. And at the same time, how that movement was kind of swept up in the tide of criminal punishment expansion that has been so central to the last 40 years in the United States. And so that anti-violence work became about collaborating with the police, and centering prosecution, and just proving that the violence against us matters by how we can get felony penalties enhanced, right? And then those organizations often taking money directly from the criminal punishment system to expand. So this, is really intense in the face of women of color critique of white feminism and its failure to comprehend racialized state violence and to understand that cops and jails and immigration systems are not the solution to violence, but are actually the central cause of violence. And that critique in the Revolution Will Not Be Funded helped us examine sort of how a pro-police and criminalization approach was institutionalized in anti-violence work, and how that approach fails to get to the root causes of violence and totally fails to actually support the organizing by survivors of violence that actually builds real safety and the ability to get out of terrible situations by attacking conditions like poverty, immigration enforcement, police violence, and family formation norms. So that book was so helpful. It really showed us exactly how nonprofitization as a strategy pushed that movement in a direction that meant it was actually less effective at the things that we needed it to do the most, right? And for the people who are most vulnerable. So in the context of LGBT and HIV work, which is what we wanted to get this conference together about, we wanted to look at the ways that story plays out in our work, which I think a lot of people have been talking about, but we wanted a space to really talk about it together. And it's a really similar story in a lot of ways, right? How the contemporary movement, emerged in this context of Stonewall and the Compton cafeteria riots, this resistance to police violence, how that was happening in a broader context of the anti-Vietnam War organizing and global anti-colonial movements and domestic uprisings against white supremacy and heteropatriarchy, and how that, in some twisted and complicated ways, how that movement could shift so drastically today be defined by pro-police, pro-military, and pro-marriage set of interventions. And how that leadership that developed as that movement professionalized came to be an extremely narrow set of mostly white professionals who built an agenda that matched their own biographies and values and or that aligned with state and corporate interests in growing and legitimizing the criminal punishment system, the military, marriage, and the current economic order. So, and of course we see inside that the intense power of just a few large donors or a few foundations to kind of shape that agenda and see which work will grow and be really visible and which work will be hardly visible at all. And this has been really, really visible to me this summer very intensely as we've seen this sudden burst of intense funding, possibly the largest gift ever given for trans advocacy, come down towards trans military inclusion work. And so we are about to see this explosion, and we're already seeing the beginnings of it, of this being a defining issue for trans politics, even though it's not at all the issue that grassroots trans movements have been naming, which has essentially been poverty and criminalization and immigration enforcement for the last 10 or 15 years. So just the kind of intensity of rich people's decision-making power in this. So, the thing that's really exciting to me about this conference is that while that's all been happening and how intense and frustrating and complicated that is for all of us to live through, we've also seen the continuing ongoing development of racial and economic justice-centered queer and trans activism, of indigenous and two-spirit and feminist activism that centers an anti-colonial critique, of queer crip resistance, of HIV and AIDS work that centers people of color, poor and homeless communities. That's also been going on during that same period and been really amazing and been developing its own work and analysis very deeply, right? And so that we've been doing that work, serving the people, base building, making our own media, and taking the welfare system, the prisons, the hospitals, the cops, the oil pipelines, et cetera, as our targets, right? And that work is, of course, far less visible when we're all dominated by corporate media that like can't wait to sell you like wedding debt and a new car and whatever more cop and war toys for your children. But we are developing that work, and that work we've been doing with this critique in our back pockets, especially since the Revolution Will Not Be Funded came out, but also before that, because of course our movements throughout time didn't use the nonprofit as the structure. That's like a very short period of history, and there's all these other strategies that we know how to use and that we have used and that we continue to use and that we sometimes rediscover and continue to experiment with. And some of the things we see ourselves doing to work against the grain of this sort of nonprofit norms are things like centering people of color leadership, not using funding, having no salaries in organizations or having flat salaries, valuing lived experience over professional degrees, using consensus decision making and collective structures, doing healing work, centering cultural work, doing direct action, centering values of transparency in our organizations, rather than kind of like sort of the corporate secrecy that's the typical nonprofit strategy. And in general, just doing work that's about making more and more and more and more and more leaders, more and more and more and more and more people engaged. An idea that that movement means mass movement, not means a few people who lead and decide and determine, and if you're lucky, maybe once a year they'll call you out for a rally after a court case. That's not what we call a movement. So this conference is our chance to really explicitly explore the obstacles. Obviously there's a lot of panels that are looking at the obstacles and the strategies people are engaging in to respond to the ways in which these structures seek to contain us and also fail to contain us, right? And so I'm really excited about that, about watching us have those conversations. One of the things I think is interesting too that's helpful, sometimes when you have this conversation, look, at least when you have it in a room full of law students, which is sometimes where I'm having it, people feel really defensive because they work in organizations that are really meaningful to them, that are organized as nonprofits, like myself included. Like a lot of people work in these spaces. These are the spaces where a lot of stuff happens. And so I think that what's really helpful to think about to kind of move past that good guys, bad guys framing, which we know as prison abolitionists is a useless framing for our movements, is to think about how neoliberalism moves us, right? So it's like, what I find when I talk to people, I've been talking to a lot of activists about why and how different organizations are getting pulled into the push for trans-military inclusion and all the ways in which this is going to be a nightmare set of pro-war arguments. And what's amazing is that everyone I talk to is anti-war and anti-military, even if their organization is doing the work, right? And so what is it about this? How do we come to do work that isn't the work we believe in? What are the complex set of things that move us? Not because people are bad people, but because conditions are complicated. And they're not just the complications of people needing a paycheck, but also the complications of how entire strategies get framed and what gets considered possible and impossible things to say in the public sphere, what can be heard by the media. These are the kinds of, things that produce shifts in all of us that don't have to be about who's doing the good work and who's a good person, who's a bad person. So I hope that we can be in that kind of framing at this conference, and I think that that's the kind of conversation that all of our panelists are ready to have, and we've all had conference calls with each panel to really be thinking about how we can engage together to talk across strategy. None of us are looking for a movement that has one strategy or one form, I hope. That is a total loser, What we're looking for is to actually have to move towards the movements that have most inspired us, use multiple strategies. People were actually in conversation and had deep shared visions and values of alternative futures and alternative ways of being together that often feels lost in the contemporary ways that nonprofitization can control us. So I'm really excited to talk to you all. I'm so grateful to everyone for being here. I'm so grateful for the conference organizers for working on it, and I'm excited to hear the next speakers.
Hello, thanks. I'm very grateful to be part of this conference and having been invited to speak at it. And I'm just going to speak a little bit about the Revolution Will Not Be Funded, kind of the context in which it developed, but also kind of what we've learned since then, or at least what I've learned since the book came out. So just to give a little bit of context, I think as Dean mentioned, the work from the Revolution Will Not Be Funded came out of the experience of the anti-violence movement dealing with the effects of the co-optation of the anti-violence movement through government funding. Again, the anti-violence movement develops with the idea that we can develop a movement to stop violence in our communities, but pretty soon the state comes in and says, well, ladies, let us give you some funding to solve that problem. But of course, when you accept our government grants, you're going to accept all the stipulations that go with this grant. So the problem we see is it's not heteropatriarchy. No, it's survivors are sick and they need healing from somebody with a PhD or an MSW. So your movement's going to be around therapy and also healing disconnected from any organizing movement for social change. We don't want you to actually change a system, we just want you to put some band-aids so you can adjust to the current system. And if you're going to do any organizing, we want you to work with the criminal justice system by calling for longer prison sentences, more police involvement. So we end up with a situation, for instance, when the Violence Against Women Act gets passed, it's actually attached to a very repressive anti-crime bill that added 50 new federal offenses, expanded the prison industrial complex by $9.7 billion, and yet this got heralded as feminist legislation in a very uncritical way. So we ended up with a system where now many anti-violence programs are actually located in police departments and are actually effectively operating as arms of the state. And all this excitement, as Beth Ritchie in her very awesome book, Arrested Justice, which you need to go buy immediately if you haven't done so, notes that we won the mainstream but lost the movement, etc. Essentially, we no longer became a movement to end violence. And in fact, I was at an anti-violence conference, and we were asked the question, what would you like to see in 20 years? And everybody said things like more shelters and more hotlines, and nobody actually said less violence. Like, we had actually completely forgot why we were here at all. Okay. And all of this, we never asked ourselves, are we actually ending up with less violence? And yet what the studies show is no, we're not. One of the effects, for instance, of the mandatory arrest laws is now batterers now know to call the police first. So we are now ending up with a situation where many people who are calling the police for who are being battered are themselves getting arrested. So many of these laws that we passed to make ourselves safer actually have made things worse. And I'm not going to give my critique of the prison industrial complex, but my Reader's Digest version is we can see that it structurally doesn't make sense as the approach to ending violence, right? If the problem was we had a few wacko people we needed to lock up, maybe that would make sense, but when we have surveys in which half of them say they would rape somebody if they thought they could get away with it, we would either have to lock up half the male population, which is not economically feasible, or we realize that we have a political problem, right? We have a society that condones gender violence, and it requires a political solution based on community transformation. It's not something that a criminal justice approach or a model social service approach is going to solve the problem for. And again, as Beth Ritchie notes, not only has this not really worked, but we've actually made things worse for many women who have become the collateral damage for our work. So to give you a couple examples, I'll note the work of Jessica Danforth with the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, who has noted in Canada in particular, for anti-violence programs to get government funding, they have to sign on saying they support the criminalization of sex work, right? And in this, there's no critique, as even the World Health Organization, not known for its radical politics, has recently come out and said the primary negative effects of all these anti-trafficking laws has been on sex workers, right? That it's actually exacerbated violence against sex workers and made things worse for them. And the reason is because the primary perpetrators of violence against sex workers is the police conducting these anti-trafficking raids, right? So in our effort to get violence for anti-violence funding for some people, we have basically made sex workers collateral damage in order to secure this funding. And I would like to mention another example I think is very important today is what's happening with Marissa Alexander. Now, you, I'm sure, are familiar with the case of Marissa Alexander, who, unlike George Zimmerman, was not able to avail herself of kind of the stand your ground policies because she was not deemed worthy of being able to defend herself. And just from firing a warning shot against her abuser, who was facing a life-threatening situation, she is now serving 20 years. Anyway, what's been very noteworthy about this is that there's been such total silence from anti-violence organizing around this case. And why is this? Well, let me just give you a statement that will be coming out very soon from the campaign for Marissa Alexander. Quote, while her prosecution unfolded, Marissa supporters reached out to local women's shelters and anti-domestic violence organizations for advocacy and support. Yet almost none of these organizations stepped up publicly to support her. In fact, there was nearly a total silence among Florida-based anti-violence organizations about Marissa's case. Why? What drove and continued to fuel this silence? Well, the answer is her supporters later learned that state officials who were invested in a narrative about Marissa's guilt threatened to cut off the funding of these organizations if they publicly advocated for her, and these organizations complied. As Beth Ritchie and others have noted, how did the anti-violence movement win the mainstream and lose the movement? How did we get to a point in which a black survivor who was attacked by her husband and then targeted by prosecutors also lose support from her own community's anti-violence organizations? When did anti-violence advocates transition their accountability from battered women and other victims to the state and funders who are actively hostile to these victims? And where are the state anti-domestic violence coalitions? Currently, only 5 state coalitions have made statements in support of Marissa. Where are the other 45? Where are the national feminist organizations even making any statements? In fact, I looked at now, they had a statement on Trayvon Martin and no statement on Marissa Alexander, right? So this case clearly shows the problem of the nonprofit industrial complex, right? Where we have shifted our focus to ensuring state funding and hence are supporting the apparatus of state violence and not supporting survivors who need our support and advocacy. So it's within this context that the Revolution Will Not Be Funded we organized that conference to begin this discussion of what should we do. Now, the idea was not to say we have the solution, although I think sometimes it gets read in that way, like drop your nonprofit job immediately. But rather, if you look at the book, people didn't actually agree at the conference, and it was more to provoke a discussion. Given this context, given how the nonprofit operates, what do we do? How do we organize? Do we work with them? If so, in what way? What are the possible strategies that we might engage? Now, the irony of this, of course, is while we had this critique of the government funding, when we originally developed, we didn't really have the critique of foundation funding. And where we started to get this critique is in a trip, ironically funded by the Ford Foundation, as you will soon find out. We met with anti-violence and other social justice activists in India, and they said, well, why are you getting funding at all? And so we thought, we hadn't thought about this. Well, we soon had to think about this very quickly because later when we got back, we had the Ford Foundation had promised to give us a $100,000 grant and said, go ahead, commit your funds. So we went and committed all the funds so that we had to then actually come up with the funds for this. And then after that, they withdrew the funding and because of our statement on Palestine. So we were in a position where basically we were trying to organize a conference. We had like 6 weeks to find $60,000. Now, the positive side is we found it. We found through just general grassroots fundraising, we were able to come up with this and show that actually sometimes we think we need more funding than we do. Like we're often not as creative about our resources. We only think to get grants and we don't think of other ways that we could raise the money. But at the same time, this showed us the danger of relying on funding grants and how quickly they can determine your agenda. They can seem to be supportive at one moment, and then the minute you go off whatever agenda they have, then you find yourself in trouble. But at this conference, I think we started to see that this was about a larger issue than simply bad foundations. Obviously, it's easy to critique the Ford Foundation, et cetera, or the ones that have big, kind of corporate backing, but there's many smaller foundations that don't have this kind of agenda. So is it an issue of kind of the bad foundations versus the good foundations? But instead, I think we saw it was part of a deeper problem about how does organizing your work through any kind of foundation funding change the way you just do the work, generally speaking. And here we start to see kind of, rats, okay, a number, well, let's see, Reader's Digest. Let's see. Okay, so the basic issue we have, and here's what kind of a model that was we learned from the World Social Movement. Many activists in Latin America said, here's a problem with you folks in North America. You're in this kind of highway of capitalism and colonialism, driving your SUV cars and making the world miserable for everybody else. And you're kind of swimming along, and some of you don't like that, though. You don't want to be destroying the world for everybody else. You want to do something different. However, the system cannot afford for you to be seriously organized because, you live in the belly of the beast, and if you were organized, that really would change the system. But also because you live in the U.S., the system has a lot of money for you that is not in other places. So what they do is they build an alternative highway for you that goes into a circle. And in this alternative highway, you can drive in your Toyota Prius car and feel very countercultural. And while you're doing this, you forget that they built the highway for you. You're going around in a circle, and this highway is still going on. Right? So this is what they said is essentially the nonprofit system. It takes your radical energies and funds it so that you're basically going around in circles. So this ends up shaping the organizing your work in a number of ways. If we were to think of kind of a handy diagram of global oppression, where 5% of the population owns 95% of the wealth, and we have this kind of pyramid system, the bad news is they have all the money and the guns, but the good news is there's a lot more of us than them. The catch is we need to get that 95% mobilized, so we need movements that are growing, growing, growing. If our movements are funding us, we have an incentive to grow our movements. But when our movements are funded by funders, even if they're nice funders, we lose that incentive to kind of develop the base we need to build social movements. We then end up prioritizing those who are good grant makers and administrators who know how to get grants, rather than those who actually know how to do grassroots organizing. And we start to become very program and short-term driven. What's the catchy thing we can write a grant on that will have a nice photo op? When most things we have to do are really boring and don't look all that interesting, like talking to your neighbors, right? What do you say? I can talk to my neighbors for the next 20 years. That doesn't just look so catchy for foundations, right? And then we also then end up kind of creating this culture of performance where we have to look like everything we did was a great success so we get funded in the next year. When in fact, most of the things we do fail, let's admit it, because if they succeeded, we would have ended global oppression by now, right? So this is why we end up not being able to share our failures, and we end up, people think that your wild success, which was actually failed miserably, was successful, so they replicate it, and we're just soon replicating So with that then, this is the larger culture that we're dealing with here. But as the Revolution Not Be Funded came out and disseminated, there's many, four things that we learned in 2 minutes. Okay, first of all, one thing I would say that the positive thing is that I've seen that it's resonated with a lot of people you won't expect. I was at an evangelical conference, don't ask me, that's part of my other work, but in any case, they were often talking about, quote, the nonprofit industrial complex. And in fact, at conservative seminaries, they're also reading The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. So this is very interesting to talk about this more in terms of provoking a conversation across the political spectrum about capitalism in ways that we didn't necessarily have previously. There's also sparked a lot of creativity in terms of thinking outside the nonprofit system. I'll just briefly mention one group in Canada. The Canadian government had funded the Sisters in Spirit campaign that was organizing around the murdered and missing women, Indigenous women in Canada, and then they defunded that program. But the families of Sisters in Spirit, and saying, screw this. Now they're doing their own community database. They're starting to think about how to do their own investigative systems and operate outside the legal system altogether in very interesting and creative ways. At the same time, however, I think there's cautions that we have learned, which is that the nonprofit industrial complex is really a smaller symptom of the larger problem, which is capitalism. And the problem is that if we just take out the nonprofit, but don't change anything else, we haven't really solved the problem. And the larger problem we have in capitalism is we tend to very individualize the way we share resources and individualize the way we do collective work on a whole. We think to do collective work when it's like do a petition drive or go march in the streets or something like that, but we don't collectivize the daycare, we don't collectivize the cooking, etc. So we can't really build movements that can engage lots of people because we end up with still a career activist model where you're supposed to do all that stuff on your private time, and then on the non-free time you really don't have, then go add another 40 hours to the movement. So if we just take out the nonprofit system and say, well, let's have day jobs and then do this as volunteer labor, we don't all have the same day jobs, right? Oh, okay. So anyway, you can see how that can turn out badly, but now I'm out of time. There's also the issue about the politics of purity, which I can't explain now, but maybe we'll have time in the Q&A, so thank you.
Hey everyone, good morning. It's great to see all of your beautiful faces. So first I want to obviously thank Urvashi and Dean and Katherine and all the organizers, and thank you for coming and being interested in engaging these ideas. I want to thank the ancestors who I believe are always with us, and in particular for some reason, and I just got weirdly choked up, I have June Jordan on my mind, and just want to like bring her here. So I'm going to start actually a little bit with a little personal story to kind of anchor my comments so you get a little bit about where I'm coming from and where the sort of the critique that I have and the experiences that I've had kind of their roots. So I'm from Iowa, first of all, which is the most important thing to know about me, from the rich black soil of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And my grandfather was worked in a meat packing factory and slaughtered pigs for 40 years. And so we're from that sort of working class industrial agricultural part of the Midwest that a lot of black workers are from and kind of gets ignored and forgotten or something. And that's important to my roots, partly because I'm secretly really country, but also because I have a fundamental and very deep faith in the people of this country. Being from Iowa and being from a place that is so often dismissed among progressives, and being my best friend was another poor kid, a white girl, redhead. I'm Irish Catholic. We were buddies, and both of our parents were single parents and survived on welfare and supported each other. And the experience of being poor and working class in Iowa is a deep part of what gives me faith that actually we can in fact build a different world, and that we have many miles to go, but it keeps my hope that we have not been sufficiently creative about our strategies for liberation, but that we can in fact win, and that we're not going to win because there's a few of us in New York and a few of us in the Bay Area and a few of us in Chicago. But we're going to win when we figure out how to unite working class people all over this country in a real movement for liberation. So I want to start there. That's the experience of being from Iowa, being poor and working class, having a single mom, and during the Reagan era. Is what politically shaped me. Growing up in the 80s, I was a free lunch kid when that ridiculous thing that some people have heard me talk about when Ronald Reagan decided that ketchup was a vegetable for free lunches. Does anybody remember that? Madness, yeah. So I was a free lunch kid there, and I was like, that shit is ridiculous. I knew that was the beginning of my consciousness that, people who are on TV, who are the people who are in charge, who are supposed to be the experts and make the big decisions about how society works, clearly don't know what they're talking about. And clearly it was people that like my mother, everyday people who understood what struggle looked like, who experienced the conditions of society, were the ones who needed to be in charge, the ones leading society. And so early on I kind of had a consciousness around this is our world to govern and run and to imagine differently. But coming up during the Reagan era was rough. And as a young adult, as a baby dyke, in fact, as black queer folks were responding to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, that was a really important moment for me to connect with other progressive black queer folks to both challenge sort of dominant frameworks around homophobia, etc., but also to challenge our own black community institutions to have a more principled and ethical and less dehumanizing response to the AIDS crisis. And so through things like Black AIDS Mobilization and other grassroots efforts, we tried to create a new kinds of space for black queer folks in our communities. And it was in that context of I had this experience. I'd gotten the privilege going off to college. I had started doing some stuff around with other black queer folks. And I was very young and passionate, and I found myself in the midst, in the mid-90s, of some really painful political campaigns. And this was the moment when there were these anti-gay wedge politics campaigns that were mobilizing working class communities of color around this idea that gay rights were special rights, right? And we're trying to pass anti-gay laws all over the place. And in that context, some amazing work happened. I mean, some amazing progressive, sometimes with Urvashi's help, trying to put together these coalitions that were multiracial, progressive, pulled together racial and economic justice organizers with predominantly white LGBT folks to try to fight back against that frame, right? But instead of just saying, no, gay rights are really important, and just leaving it there, we were trying to say, actually, what's gonna move forward here is if we have an alliance that includes all of us, and where that challenges white LGBT folks to actually genuinely embrace racial economic justice work, so it's not just like a framing or a message for a rally or something, so that we could avoid working class communities of color being organized by the right in the first place, right? And that organizing, we won some things, we lost some things, but overall it kind of broke my heart, honestly. And it's part of what left me basically leave a lot of queer work for 20 years. The heartbreak both of the intensity of the hatefulness that I personally experienced during that time, but also it was right when I saw with my own eyes what has been described in the queer movement of the incredible narrowness of so many white LGBT activists, the ignorance and arrogance of single issue politics, and people, like one of the most ridiculous things was in many places around the country, white LGBT activists would lecture working class women of color that like, don't you know better than to roll with these Christian evangelical folks. I mean, just word to death, you never lecture or what. That's just kind of basic. That's sort of like 101. But even beyond the 101 part of it, in terms of the power dynamics there, it was just so deeply problematic from a strategy, from so many perspectives, right? And it was pretty amazing to me. And I saw the sort of consolidation of that worldview and that set of politics during the 90s, and sort of walked away and decided, both from a personal perspective and from a strategy perspective, that it made sense for me to really anchor myself in the struggles of working class communities of color and be an out queer person and be a queer organizer with queer politics in the grassroots organizing struggles in my communities. And one more story on that. I remember the last Pride March I was at, and it was in 1990, so it's, I'm 44, it was a long time ago, right, to be queer and not be at a Pride March. And it was here in New York, and I remember the throngs of white people, and there were a lot of cute girls, don't get me wrong, but there were a lot of throngs of white men in particular, and I just got hit with this image of like, what are their day jobs? And which side are they really on? And I don't mean that in a like, oh, I feel excluded kind of way, but just more like fundamentally, like, is this a movement for social justice or not? And I was like, I don't think so. It was just like this very deep moment. And I was young, but old enough to remember when our marches didn't have corporate sponsorship, and so sort of this whole like corporate thing going down, and I was like, I think he actually works at that bank and is making just redlining decisions about my community, and even though he's in this gay pride march. And so that led me to 15 years, really deep dive in the Bay Area, doing grassroots organizing in working class communities of color, in a nonprofit, working with my own base building organization. We're actually transitioning a more traditional advocacy organization into a base building organization and building alliances with other base building organizations. But honestly, by about 2010, this was post the economic recession, and I had, all the themes of the revolution will not be funded, I was experiencing personally, as I didn't come to run a grassroots organizing institution where, the leaders were amazing, Latina and African American women and young people who were doing these incredible campaigns around police accountability and school transformation and expanding public services and taxing rich people and all this awesome stuff. But I was an ED, I had become an ED, and I had become a nonprofit manager somehow, and like raising resources and managing budgets and boards and all that crap. And that's not why I got into, I mean, it's why so many of us, it's not why I got into the work, was to be a manager. And then 2011 happened, and people around the world were like taking to the streets, and Occupy was happening, and the air uprisings were happening, and we were like, what are we doing? We are getting our asses kicked here in the belly of the beast. We're not winning. Our organizations are winning incredibly important reform fights, but we're not winning the war. We're losing, and we don't have a clear strategy to win. And I could not, both psychologically and politically, figure out how to continue in my role with that level of frustration and clarity about what we weren't able to do. And I transitioned out of my organization, and I spent a year with Steve Williams interviewing 158 organizers around the country in a project that we called Ear to the Ground, where we asked people, other organizers and activists, what are you thinking about this moment, this sort of post-2011 moment? And I want to share with you a little bit about what they said. So, well, first of all, I would say, because we talk to people confidentially, people weren't cheerleaders for their organizations, which was so awesome and refreshing, right? People told the truth about how frustrated they were, how our jobs didn't reflect their real values. People talked about just feeling constrained and hemmed in and unclear about how what they were doing was connected to broader struggle, all the stuff that I had been feeling myself. And they were able to articulate that. But people did say a key strength is that base building has been growing in the last 20 years. And that is important, and increasingly intersectional organizing has been happening in working class communities of color, and that's a highlight and needs to be continued, even within the contradictions of the nonprofit form. But 60% of all those folks said our current organizational forms are insufficient. Our existing nonprofit forms alone can't obviously address the structural nature of this crisis. We need more alliances, we need non-C3 alternative economic models, we need C3, C4 electoral forms, and we need new kinds of non-C3 grassroots spaces and explicitly left spaces that reflect the conditions of today, and I'll talk more about that later. 50% of folks said that our movement is fragmented. Okay. So a third of all those folks we talked to said we lack a clear, coherent, and inspiring vision of the world that we're fighting for. That progressives have long lists of policy ideas, and different sectors have really inspirational and interesting ideas that they're fighting for, but as collectively, we don't actually have an idea of what an alternative to the current system is. We have criticism of capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy, but we don't actually know what we're fighting for, and a movement that doesn't know what it's fighting for can't really figure out a strategy for winning. Almost a third of folks said that this lack of a coherent long-term strategy or strategies was part of what was exacerbating the inherent contradictions of the nonprofit form. Because if you at least have a movement-wide strategies, right, then you can use those movement-wide strategies, not accountable to funders, to shape and get these nonprofit forms to work towards your strategy, right? But without that broader strategy, people are just sort of individually figuring it out on their own, and it's exacerbating the contradictions that are inherent in it. People did talk about the disproportionate power of foundations. That's harmful to movement building. But no one was throwing the baby away with the bathwater there, and that the deeper question was around what is our strategy for liberation, essentially? What is our strategy to replace the system of capitalism, and where do the nonprofit organizations fit within that broader strategy? So it's a strategy question. And so I guess I want to leave you with, I brought flyers for that report because I can't go through all the amazing and brilliant things that people said, but I would recommend that you read it. So I just want to leave you with 3 thoughts. One, it's a theme here today, and I want to emphasize that theme. There's no substitute to base building. If you believe that we have structural problems, we need structural solutions, base building is the building blocks of movement building. There's no getting around it. Second, we have to shift our own individualistic thinking. We need to be more self-reflective about our own careerism and ambition, and let go of it and figure out how to be in service of grassroots organizing, even if you yourself are not an organizer. And third, we need to believe in the possibility of real transformation and be willing to have hope in it and not be stuck in our own pragmatism and stuck in our own, essentially, defeatism, where you may think that one day far, far, far in the future, real change can happen, but it's so far in the future that it's not worth really planning for, that is what lets us stay stuck in the current work that we're doing. And so letting go of that and being willing to invest. So I and a couple of other people here have started this thing called LeftRoots, which is a new formation of those of us who are anti-capitalist, but are grounded in on-the-ground movement building work and who want a space outside of our C3 work to figure out together what is our alternative vision and what is our strategy for moving forward that can then inform our day-to-day work. Thank you very much.
What an incredible set of talks, and I apologize to them and to all of you for cutting them off. But I did that in the service of giving you some time to ask questions and to push a little deeper.
Could Andy say more about the purity politics since she started that?
So sometimes this got interpreted as like you can never ever work with a nonprofit, which implies that there's some pure space you can work that's not implicated in capitalism. So instead, what maybe we should think about is not avoid all nonprofits, but is there a more strategic way to engage nonprofits? And that is in other places where there's large revolutionary movement, it's not like they never use a nonprofit, but they don't do the organizing through the nonprofit. Like they have a movement that funds itself, and if they need a short-term project, they might set up a nonprofit to get that funding, but the nonprofit answers to the movement, it's not the movement itself, and if the nonprofit gets defunded, they're not screwed because that's not what they're relying on. So this then makes us think, can we just kind of think more strategically about nonprofits? They could be helpful, one, in creating kind of a buffer between movements and the state, and they could support movements, but we might be more effective if we thought of them as separate from movements for social change, instead see them as something that could support movements for social change.
What a wonderful collection of inspiring ideas, thoughts, and action. And I only wish I could speak as quickly as Dean. Thank you all. So I guess for me, I think Katherine called on me because I'm the oldest person in the room. It's great to see all of you. My question is, where are you seeing some of the disruption, the interruption of capitalism, of kind of corporate and politics? Name names. Where are we seeing some of the transformation, bubbling up? Because I think there are entities out there that are doing something that you all speak of in different ways.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? Are you asking what are the organizations who have this strategic approach to the work that Andrea was just talking about? Or do you mean outside of the nonprofit form, what are the organizations that are taking on capitalism, empire, etc.?
I think if it's happening in those different places, I would say both.
Well, maybe to start, I think the thing that gives me inspiration is that there's a whole sector of organizations, and there's some people who are here that sometimes is called like the left edge of organizing, and who, so there's incredible organizations. Kuah is here, and Song, Alina's up there somewhere, and in the Bay, Council Justa, Just Cause, and Power are these organizations that are little nonprofit community organizations, that are doing base building, developing grassroots leaders, engaging them in their own campaigns to improve conditions right now, but doing that with a conscious anti-capitalist framework and political education and analysis so that people are clear that they're not going to end poverty through this minimum wage campaign. And people, members are clear that this education reform that they're winning is not going to be the key to liberation for Black and brown children, and so that then it's those organizations, when Occupy was happening, are the ones already where the grassroots leaders are already positioned to go and do direct action on Wells Fargo and be able to really make the connection, like, oh, on my day-to-day life, I do housing rights work, but Wells Fargo is part of the 1%, and they're part of this incredible economic inequality that's happening globally, and actually I envision a world where we don't have a 1%, and I'm going to go do direct action at Wells Fargo. And so to me, that is one really exciting models, that organizations like that are able to make those connections and be relevant. They're not marginal organizations. They're not doing that from this like, oh, we're just 5 people and we're just trying to pit up the, these are big, they have thousands of members and are winning policy fights and, are relevant organizations, but are doing that with this larger consciousness, and so then able to link up with more explicitly anti-capital or anti-1% struggles.
Just to add, well, there's many organizations, but also what I've noticed is that the nonprofit system tends to invest as an organizational survival rather than movement survival. But it's so important that a specific organizational form remain intact. And I know some people get out of the nonprofit, that's not necessarily the primary goal, right? That organization may seem to fold, but it's not, the work hasn't stopped, it just takes a different organizational form. So I think we also have to kind of pay attention to kind of these flows of movements that may have different kind of organizational faces. But what I'm seeing is, to kind of summarize this work, is people that are saying, if we're going to replace the system, we essentially have to start figuring out how to run things ourselves. Because if the system collapsed tomorrow, it wouldn't necessarily get replaced by something better. In fact, probably would not. So, if we're going to challenge the system, we actually have to create our capacity to say how would we run things ourselves. So what I'm saying is an increased emphasis on this kind of work in many different forms. For instance, of course, the anti-violence work, there's the work on transformative justice and community accountability. INCITE's having a international conference, 2015 Bay Area March. Save the date on kind of community accountability, transformative justice, taking it kind of to the next level of engagement. In the educational system, like through the Critical Ethics Studies Association, but many other groups are developing alternatives to the academic industrial complex. They say, why are we invested in this current academic system that's inherently capitalist? But let's actually build our own educational systems now, right? So all across the place, healthcare movements, again, they're saying like, let's, instead of just asking for better healthcare, let's create our own healthcare systems. So I think this is kind of a strand across the different movements of thinking, not just how do we contest the current system, but how do we replace it by practicing the system that we actually want to replace instead.
I just want to thank all the panelists. It was really unbelievably inspiring to hear you all. My question is about kind of the left movement and the queer movement. And several of you articulated the problem with a queer movement that doesn't have left politics. But I'd like you to speak to a left movement that maybe has had trouble integrating queer politics, which we haven't talked about. And I was thinking specifically of the Dreamers, who have inspired all of us. For those of you who, do everybody know who the Dreamers are? The Dreamers are the young people who came out as undocumented to challenge their lack of access to public support in this country. And we know so many of them are queer, and yet that is a story that's not told about the Dreamers as we move forward in the immigrant rights movement. And so I say this not to criticize the left movement, but on both sides, I think, and we know so many queer people who are working in left movements that put their queerness to the bottom of the issue, myself included, actually. You come out, it's almost like, well, I say I'm a lesbian, so that means I've done that work. And I've been thinking a lot about that lately, and it would really help me to hear your responses to that, because I feel like somehow that's dropped to the bottom.
I suspect each of us has a take on this, because we've all struggled with the same questions. So thank you for asking that. I don't know if I'm going to answer it, but one of the things that's been amusing to me, answer the question you hear, I've been struck by how many situations I've been in lately where non-queer people are saying to groups of queers, of which I'm a part, how'd you do it? Oh my God, I can't believe it. What is the secret? How'd you do it? And it's kind of annoying and really depressing to me, that question, even though they're well motivated. And I don't mean to put anybody down who's asking the question, because they want to know the magic bullet.
Yeah,
that
they ask when you're getting married, that's even worse.
decision and got us to do that. What would you say, Spade?
They're asking you when you're getting married, which is even worse.
Well, leave that aside, but the strategy is a good question of moving people to ask each other. But what's depressing to me about it is that it displays an ignorance of decades of work. These people, I'm tempted to be snarky and say, how do we do it? Well, thousands of us died in the HIV/AIDS years, and they're continuing to die. And thousands of us, laid our bodies on the line and experienced brutal violence and poverty. And, what do you think got us here? Was a sustained struggle and happening at multiple levels, and basically a strategy that worked because it appeals to the mainstream, because it made us more comprehensible to straight people. I mean, that's why marriage works. It makes us more, it's easier to sell yourself as a married person than as a sexual outlaw. And so, and I, full disclosure, I'm married. So, the other way I want to answer your question is that yes, the left continues to have a blinders problem and an ignorance problem, and it's really frustrating in the domains in which I have been operating in the last dozen years around funding. It's deeply frustrating and infuriating. How can the Rockefeller Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, any of these major multi-billion-dollar foundations get away with zero grant making on LGBT issues? How can the largest community foundation in this country, I think it's the largest, the New York Community Trust, get away with the paltry amount that it gives to the New York queer community every year? It's because we're still seen as other, and I don't know, I mean, there's deeper reasons and deeper analysis we can go into, but I'll just stop with that. Do you want to say more?
I think that one of the things that interests me about your question, and also Urvashi response too, is the ways in which queer politics and maybe, or like lesbian gay politics, maybe student trans politics is being used to actually discipline the left. So I think you can see this in like the ways in which like institutions like the military and marriage and the criminal punishment system get rehabilitated through the spectrum of hate crimes laws, same-sex marriage, and service of LGBT people in the military. It's like straight people are terrified of being homophobic, and so then they're like, I have to be for this thing. I mean, so I watch Democracy Now! Every day. And it's like, here's Amy Goodman just like, war sucks, war sucks, war sucks. And it's just like, and here's Dan Choi, and it's so great being so in the military. And you're like, really? Like, and I'm like this thing over and over again. And I think we see this more broadly, I think, like with the discussion about pinkwashing and the explicit ways in which, Israel has marketed itself as a gay-friendly country to, I think the audience of that is people like straight people on the left in the U.S. who they want to have a strong feeling about Israel. That's not the feeling, Southern colonial nightmare. And so they go, this is something that these people feel a certain level of anxiety about that will make them attach. You know what I mean? And so I feel like that's an interesting piece of this too. And when people say like, why is like the gay stuff so successful? It's like the only gay stuff that's so successful at this level is the stuff that's completely aligned with the worst projects of neoliberalism. So it's like, because it's state sponsored, like that's actually that's a nightmare. So I think it's this complicated thing to really figure out just that dilemma. And I think we miss something. I feel like lately when I've been trying to think about this trans military stuff, my real audience is non-trans people who are going to think that because of their transphobia, they need to take this up on our behalf. And that is such a mistake, but that is the level that we're at right now. I mean, that's,
So this is awful. The time thing, I mean. So we have a lot more we want to do today, and we've already run over on this panel, and so I hate to cut this discussion short, but I have to because we have to begin where we're going to go next.